Let's just mention in review three topics that we spoke about recently
I don't know if
with
anybody
regard to
else is
Kiddush.
here yet.
The first topic that you may recall was the Tosas Rid, who says that Yayin L'Kiddush is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And we were wondering, according to the Tosas Rid, how do you interpret the Gemara in Shabbos that concludes that Ner Chanukah Odif, that if you have a choice between buying Yayin for the mitzvah of Kiddush or buying Shemen for the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, then you give preference to the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, which is only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, whereas Yayin is a halacha Moshe Sinai. Presumably, we're talking about a mitzvah d'Oraisa. So we suggested that there are two categories of a halacha Moshe Sinai. One halacha Moshe Sinai reflects on a d'Oraisa, and it tells you exactly how to fulfill a mitzvah d'Oraisa. For example, the shear of a nekev for a mikvah in order to be mitayr someone who's tovil in the mikvah, that certainly is a halacha Moshe Sinai which reflects on a d'Oraisa, namely on tevilah. There's another category of halacha Moshe Sinai which generates a brand new category, a new din, a new kiyum, a new obligation. It doesn't reflect on a mitzvah shel Torah. And that would be, for example, in the case of treifos, let's say, where the Rambam has a whole list in Hilchos Shchita of the various treifos, but he says that only one of them is in the Torah itself. So in a sense, the Halacha Moshe Sinai is creating brand new categories, breaking new ground. And we found that the nafkamina between these two categories of Halacha Moshe Sinai would be suffix. So the Rambam, for example, says that if you had a suffix about the size of a nekev, which would be machshir the mikvah because there's only 20 saw here and 20 saw here, and you need a nekev between, in the mechitza that separates between the two sides in order to allow for a chibur to be machshir the tefillah. And the Rambam says you have to be machmir in that case. But in halacha Moshe Sinai, that creates and breaks new ground, like for example, the treifos, then the Rambam says suffix lahakel, you could be makil. So now getting back to Kiddush, when we were studying the Tosas Rid, we were wondering whether the halacha Moshe Sinai of Kiddush requiring yayin is a new chiyuv or it reflects back on the chiyuv of Zachas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. If it reflects on Kiddush D'Oraisa, then given that category of halacha Moshe Sinai, you would have to say suffix l'chumra, and the halacha Moshe Sinai would have an equal status to any D'Oraisa. There's no room to justify the Gemara's conclusion that Shemen l'ner Chanukah trumps Yayin l'Kiddush. But if we assume, and we were medayik in the lashon of the Tosas Rid, that the nature of this halacha Moshe Sinai is to create a makom su'uda, that b'makom kriya sham tehei achila, that you set up your Suda Shabbos in the place where you make Kiddush. And how do you do so? By making Kiddush al Yayin or Pas. So the Yayin or Pas now facilitates creating a makom Suda so that now you can be Mekayim your Achila in a makom Suda, in a makom Kiddush. If that be the case, then the Halacha Moshe Sinai is creating a whole new category. It's not reflecting on Zachar, on Kiddush, but rather on Seuda and Achila, and therefore we could be more Mekil, like we saw in Safek Halacha Moshe Sinai in the Rambam Hilchos Shchita. Then I want to just mention that we had a long discussion about the Rajba, And basically, we had three different approaches to the Rashba's understanding of Yayin L'Kiddush, and it went from one polar extreme to the other. On the one extreme, we said that the Rashba indicates in his Chidushim that Yayin L'Kiddush is Doraisa. Hands down, that would mean that it's Likuva, and it's critical. It's not, it's indispensable. On the other extreme, we had the Rashba in Chuvas, who said that all you need is Amiras Dvarim for Kiddush. That's the Kiddush of the Torah, which would then mean that Kiddush al Yayin is purely D'Rabbanan. But we wanted to reconcile that Rashba in Chuvas with the Rashba in Chidushim, and we came up with a middle ground that Enochinami Yayin is Doraisa, but it's only L'Chatchila, not Likuva. And you may recall that we mentioned that there are many occasions in which the Torah adds a L'Chatchila, but it's not Likuv. So the mitzvah should be fulfilled in such a way ideally, but that requirement is only L'Chatchila. And then we suggested a third pshat in the Rashba, in which the Rashba holds that Kiddush is D'Rabbanan, but it has a lasa d'oraisa. It has like a reflection on a mitzvah d'oraisa of Kiddush. And we came up with 6 different nafkaminas to these 3 different approaches how to learn the Rashba. Then to review, we started with the Taz. The Taz, if you recall, made Kiddush by mistake on a cup of water instead of a cup of Yayin. And the question is, was he Yotzei the mitzvah of Kiddush, or does he have to make a new Kiddush when he figures out his mistake, and now will make Kiddush the right way on Yain? Now, we're studying the original position of the Taz on this issue. Later on, the Taz rejects it, but originally the Taz held that the mitzvah that the Rabbanan created of Yayin is lahasmich es hayayin l'kiddush al Torah. In other words, the Yayin of the Rabbanan is not a separate new category of a chiyuv Kiddush, but rather it's meant to be attached to the mitzvah of Kiddush d'oraisa. Therefore, says the Taz, once you already fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa, albeit on a cup of water instead of a cup of wine, then it's too late. You cannot now make another Kiddush, which will stand on its own independent of Kiddush d'oraisa, because the mitzvah of Yayin, as established by the Rabbanan, was meant to be attached to the mitzvah d'oraisa. Doesn't stand on its own. And the Taz brings a proof of this in the case of Nishpach HaYayin. He made Kiddush on a cup of wine, and then before he got a chance to drink the wine, he spilled the cup. And the Shulchan Aruch is going to paskin in such a case that he doesn't have to make Kiddush again. He'll take another cup of wine and he'll drink another cup of wine. Yeah, we didn't discuss the Bar Pri Hagafen aspect. That has to be taken under advisement. So once again, the Taz is building his sheet on the fact that when the Rabbanan instituted the requirement of Yayin for Kiddush, they did not do so to set up a brand new independent entity called Kiddush Rabbanan, but rather they set it up as being samuch, as being attached, so to speak. It's like, on the tail of the wings of the plane, it's to be samuch to Kiddush d'oraisa. So now, in the case where he made Kiddush al Mayim, he already finished and achieved his kiyum of Kiddush d'oraisa. Therefore, there's no room for Kiddush Rabbanan when he takes in wine, and the proof was from Nishpach that he doesn't repeat Kiddush again. The Taz claims that the Tur in Shulchan Aruch will support his position. Now, what did the Torah say? The Torah was addressing the question of Kiddush and Shul. And he was wondering whether or not you could be Yotzei the mitzvah of Kiddush when you hear Kiddush and Shul. So the Kiddush is Al Hayayin, but the people are only listening to the Kiddush. They don't drink from the cup of wine. And the Torah claims that really they can fulfill their mitzvah by hearing the Kiddush in Shul, but they need to make Kiddush when they get home because of an halacha of Makom Suda, that ain't Kiddush el b'Makom Suda. So since the Beis HaKnesses is not a Makom Suda, they're not eating a meal there. Therefore, when they get home, they have to recite Kiddush b'Makom Suda. It would seem that the Torah is maintaining that if not for the halacha of Makom Suda, then they could be Yotzei the mitzvah of Kiddush Shel Torah just by listening. So the question is, what did the Taz find in this tour? He doesn't spell it out. He leaves it sort of ambiguous. There's something bothering the Taz, and apparently he resolved it by quoting this tour. So let's suggest the following. When the Rabbanan instituted Yayin for Kiddush, is the Ikar mitzvah the Amira, right, the Divrei Shevach that we spoke about, but it's got to be Al Hayayin, or do they institute a mitzvah of Shtias Hakos? Now let me explain the difference between the two. We have a principle with regard to Amiros and Brachos and so forth called Shomea Ka'ona. You could listen to someone else's recitation and you could be Yotzei. However, there is something called a mitzvah shebegufo, something that has to be fulfilled with your guf. That doesn't lend itself to some sort of vicarious, listening to someone, with regard to Kriya and Amiras Habracha, then you could say Shomea Ka'ona. I hear it, that's enough. It's as if I said it. No difference. But with regard to Shtia, if the mitzvah itself is Shtia on the guf, then I can't send a representative, an agent, to implement that Maisa Haguf on my behalf. I have to do that myself. There's no, shall we say, proxy who could represent a mitzvah shebeguf. So, for example, if I'm Tomei, I have to go to the mikveh myself. And if, for example, I need to eat something, I have to eat it myself because it's the mitzvahs in the guf. Now, what that means is that the shomim who listen to the Kiddush in Shul, if you're going to argue that essentially Kiddush means Amiras Dvarim, but you just have to recite it over the kos, somebody has to drink the kos, that's already a different halacha, but that's not part of the essence of the mitzvah of Kiddush al Yayin, then all they have to do is listen to the Kiddush of the Makadish, and that's fine. But if you're going to tell me that the mitzvah of Yayin, the way the Rabbanan established it, is a mitzvah shebegufo, the shtia itself, then it would come out that everyone in the shul who wants to be Yotzei his mitzvah of Kiddush, let's say he doesn't have a Suda, whatever it might be, he would have to drink from the kos Yayin. And we don't find such a thing. So therefore, based on this tour, we come to the conclusion that the essence of the mitzvah of Kiddush the Rabbanan, the requirement of Yayin, is the recitation rather than the Shtia. And that has tremendous repercussions, argues the Taz, for the case of Kiddush al Kosmayim. Because if you're going to say that the shtia is the essential part of the mitzvah of Kiddush al Yayin, then in this case where he made Kiddush al Amayim, he's missing the essential mitzvah. And therefore he should have to repeat his Kiddush again. Or for example, the case of Nishpach, when the cup spilled, obviously he's not involved in shtia. How could then the halacha say that he was Yotzei Kiddush? I mean, Midrabanan, he wasn't Yotzei Kiddush. But the answer is based on the Tur that the Iker of Kiddush is not the shtia, but rather the Amira. And therefore, whether it's the case of Nishpach HaKos or the case of Kiddush B'tos Al Kos Mayim, in both cases, he has the Iker mitzvah of reciting Kiddush Al Yayin. Did he drink the wine? No. He didn't get a chance to drink the wine. But the Amira he has. So far, where we're holding now, the Tur and after him the Taz are holding that the mitzvah of Kiddush, even Midrabanan, is not the Ikaro, the Shtia, but rather the Amira. And the Kos Yayin should supplement the Amira, or shall we say upgrade the Amira, enhance the Amira, and be samach to the Amira, such that after he has the Amira, then although he messed up as far as the Yayin is concerned, fine. Let him bring another kos and drink another kos for Yayin. But the Kiddush itself, he doesn't have to repeat. Now, it seems to my mind that the model for the Taz's structure on Kiddush al Yayin is Hidur Mitzvah. Again, I'm not saying, please let me emphasize this, that the Taz is operating with Zeh Keli V'Aved. We're talking about a Takana de Rabbana. Rabbana required Yayin. But there's a certain striking similarity to Hidur Mitzvah. Because just like in Hidur Mitzvah, the Hidur has to be somehow built into the original Maisa Mitzvah. But once the Maisa Mitzvah was completed, it's too late for Hidur. And in the Nimshal, the same thing is with Yayin L'Kiddush, according to the Taz. Once you've already recited Kiddush and you finished it, and the Yayin was not attached to the Kiddush itself, then finito. You fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush D'Oraisa, but there's no room for being mahader with the Kiddush al Yayin because you're already done with the mitzvah of Kiddush. And the Rabbanan only established it as an attachment, which I call, again, not to equate them, but similar, a Hidur mitzvah. And this is going to be a fascinating question, whether or not there's Hidur mitzvah after the Maisa mitzvah was already done. For example, we have a Maisa mitzvah called the Tilas Dalid Minim on Sukkot. You have to take the lulav, the esrog, and so forth and so on. So Rav Chaim Brisker, in order to sharpen his students and test them and see if they understood, he would put on the table two esrogim. One esrog, he said, it didn't look too nice, but it was an esrog. The other esrog looked beautiful, but he wasn't sure it was an esrog. It was a suffix esrog, suffix lemon. Anyway, the two esrogim are there on the table, and obviously you could take both of them. But Reb Chaim challenged his Talmidim and asked them which one should he take first. And immediately, without even thinking, as a knee-jerk response, the Talmidim answered, take the one that's vadei kosher. Don't start with something that might be an esrog, might be a lemon. And Reb Chaim said, you're wrong. Think about it again. Reb Chaim says in the sequence, take the one that's a suffix esrog first, and only then take the vadei esrog. Why? Because If he takes the Vadei Esrog first, he was Yotze the mitzvah. When he takes the second esrog, which might or might not be an esrog, and it's a beautiful esrog, he could not achieve zekel yaveu because he already finished his netilas esrog. But if, on the other hand, he takes the esrog that's a suffix first, then either it's nothing, and then he's going to take the one that's a vade kosher and be yotze with that, or it might be a real McCoy esrog, in which case he achieves the zekel yaveu with this beautiful esrog. The point of this exercise and testing the Talmidim was to show the Talmidim that they understand that once the mitzvah is achieved, there's no point, no room for hidur mitzvah. And I'm using that as a kind of like a what do they call it? Like a magnifying glass. I don't know what you want to call it. That through this, this hole, I could see something about the Taz. The Taz is saying that, okay, you made Kiddush mistakenly on Mayim, but it's too late. You were already Yotze the mitzvah through the Maisa Kiddush of Amiras Dvarim min Torah. And if this was the premise of the Taz's Shita, that if Yayin is an attachment, so you want to enhance that mitzvah, you can't enhance the mitzvah once it's gone. However, this is not all so simple. Because there's a machlokas rishonim about something in the mitzvah of Milah called tzitzin she'eno ma'akvin es ha'milah. What does that mean? When the circumcision is done, then there are certain parts of the membrane that have to be cut, and without that, it's not Milah. But then there's something called tzitzin she'eno ma'akvin, which you would cut if it's possible because of zekel yaveh. It enhances the mitzvah, and it's a kiyum of hidur mitzvah. So a whole school of Rishonim say, should he go back on tzitzin she'eno ma'akvin es hamilah? And this is a question of whether you could do it on Shabbos if the eighth day turns out to be Shabbos. It all depends. Piresh or lo piresh? What does that mean? Right, the moel is holding on to the knife. I just saw this recently up front because I was the sandik and my great-grandson's bris. And he cut the tzitzin ha'akvim, and then he was poresh. He lifted up his hand with the knife. Eino choser. But lo piresh, if he's still in the thrust, in the action of cutting the tzitzin, then choser. Even though it's Shabbos, he can continue to cut the tzitzin she'eino ma'akvin es hamilah. So that's one school of Rishon. And the Brisker Rav, in his presentation on Hilchas Chanukah, I'll tell you why it comes into Chanukah, says that the logic that underlies this Shita is that once he was Piresh, he completed his Maisa mitzvah, and there's no room for hidur mitzvah. He can't be Mahad the mitzvah after the Maisa is done. It's complete, finito. But in Lo Piresh, then he's still involved in, shall we call it, the extended Maisa Milah, and therefore he's Choser al Tzitzin She'eino ma'akvin es hamilah even on Shabbos. However, there's another school of Rishonim, and they maintain, it's actually Machlok Shin Rashi in the Ram, but they maintain that even if he was Piresh, he could still be Mahad the mitzvah and cut the tzitzin she'eino ma'akvin es hamilah. And that approach seems to undermine everything that we've said until now. namely that once the mitzvah d'oraisa was fulfilled, it's too late to be mahader the mitzvah. You can't enhance or, in the framework of the Taz, attach a mitzvah to a mitzvah that's already done. Now the Brisker Rav wants to extrapolate from this a new interpretation of the Ramah. The Ramah in Hilchas Chanukah quotes the Yesha Omrim that even after they lit the candles, if let's say they decide now that they want to add candles keneged yomim hanichnasim, so that even though me'ikar adin, the main mitzvah is ner yishu beisa, one ner is enough, now they decided, well, we got more candles, whatever it might be, let's light 5 candles because it's the 5th night. Not only that, the Ramah says that even on every single night, the Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, would have every single person light his own candle. And the Brisker Rav asks the obvious question, what do you mean every person light his own candle? Once the Ner was lit, the first Ner, and the bias was supplied with the Ner Chanukah, then the mitzvah was completed. How can you then fulfill the mitzvah Mahadrin and Mahadrin? Well, Mahadrin. It's too late. And the Brisker says we should go back to Mila and Tzitzin, Sheinem Akvanis Mila, and see, can you add an enhancement, a Hidur, after the mitzvah was complete? So that's the discussion about Hidur mitzvah. I was thinking that according to those Rishonim that Chozrim al Tzitzin Shein Ma'akvenis Mila even after Piresh, that maybe Mila has its own unique status in halacha. Why? Because there are 2 dimensions to the mitzvah Mila. There's the Maisa Mila, and there is the Chefza of Mohul. Like, for example, I mean, listen, I got it to, but David Amel says, I'm not naked of mitzvahs because I have the Mila. So maybe when the mitzvah is not just the Maisa mitzvah, but also there's a victim, there's a Chefza, there's an object. And the object itself could be mitzaref, it could link together various Maisim. So he did the first Maisa Mila, he was Yotze, but yet he could do another Maisa Mila, and the Chefetz itself now is enhanced. Masha Enken, in the case of Lulav, that we mentioned in the name of Reb Chaim, there he did the Maisa of Netilas Lulav on the Esrog that was Vade Kosher, and he was Yotze. There's no subsequent Maisa Netila. So now he picks up the other Esrog that has a heather to it, but it's already too late. And in terms of Ner Chanukah, perhaps we could say that the Mahadrin set up an independent chiyuv on each person. Meaning, even though Me'ikar Adin Ner Yishu Beso, and one Ner suffices for the entire bias, I don't care how many people are in the bias, but the Mahadrin want to get every single person involved, and that's what the Ramah means, that everyone should light their own Chanukah candles. But this does not in any way undermine our assumption that, as a general rule, Hidur mitzvah requires that you enhance the Maisa mitzvah before it's actually completed. And again, in the Nimshal, which again is a bit of perhaps a leap of faith, but I think in the Taz you could say the same thing, that when the Yayin is there from the get-go, and you recited Kiddush al Yayin, then the Yayin enhances the Kiddush. And he was masmith the Yayin to the Amir's Kiddush. But in the case of Nishpach, or in the case of Kos Mayim, there it's already too late. He already finished his mitzvah. The Maisa Kiddush was complete. So what are you going to do now? There's no possibility of enhancing or attaching yayin through another act of Kiddush. Okay, then we'll stop here, and I wish everyone a great week. Thank you so much.